don't have oxygen piped through the walls. This one doesn't either. So we bleed in low flow oxygen through a nipple adapter in the back, up to 15 liters. In the hospital, sometimes hospitals would prefer to have your 50 psi oxygen source where you can have up to 100% VO2. So that's the main difference between the two devices. We can add an extra proximal flow sensor on this version, though I can say I've never consulted on a case that we actually had to do it. We really prefer our
That's
passive
one of the
circuit.
tough things with somebody's real sensitive with oxygenation. When we bleed it into the back, there's a lot of flow going through here. It really dilutes it. So, really to send somebody home, they should be under 40%. So.
Yeah, so we'll talk through that a little bit
Sorry.
too. No, remind me when we talk about circuits, I'll kind of explain why that happens and
Yes.
why we would want to try and have a patient below 40% before they're ready to go home. So externally looking at the device, we'll talk through a few things. What you'll notice on the device itself is whatever word is above the button is what the button means at any given time. So the meanings of the buttons change as you navigate through everything. We'll go through and navigate a few things, but in general, alarm silence button, on-off button, light that tells you if it's plugged in or not plugged in, and then again, these change meaning. So if I press this button, I'll get into the menu. If you come upon the device and the device were locked, meaning when you went into the menu, you didn't see anything that we as an RT would want to take a look at, the way to unlock the device, if you didn't see this unlock here already, is to hold in the downward arrow and the alarm silence button for 3 seconds. You hear that double beep, and you can now access the clinical menu where you can actually go in and make any changes that are necessary.
Is that how you lock it too?
So if it already has the lock feature turned on, after 5 minutes it's just going to revert back to locking. If it were never locked, if you want to lock it because there's a doctor who likes to come in and change the vent without telling you that they changed it, you will scroll down to the word that says options and hit select. And then menu access, you're going to turn to limited. It's the very first option in the menu once you go into options there. That happens at too many hospitals actually, so you're not alone if it's happening here. But going back into that clinical menu, you can take a look at some waveforms. It allows you to switch to your secondary settings, so we have the ability to set 2 different settings on the device. Maybe not something you do a ton of here at the hospital, but if it is something that you start using more, again, we talked about some hospitals that might use a vent in the PACU, and you start invasively, but you extubate and move to non-invasive. Or in the ER, maybe you started with non-invasive and you intubate because the patient continued to decline. You could have both prescriptions kind of already lined up and just toggle between the two. In the home setting, we have patients who will use maybe pressure support during the day, but more formal settings at night. Some of our neuromuscular kids, as they get older, some Duchenne's kids will do mouthpiece ventilation during the day, where we have a straw positioned in front of their mouth, and then they'll use a mask at night. And so there's lots of functionality for taking advantage of that dual prescription feature. So we can completely set 2 different prescriptions, but not give the patient any access to changing anything. They would merely have access to toggling between the 2 prescriptions. If you wanted to change anything, you would just highlight primary settings and alarms and hit this select button, which would take you into the menu. Then using the up and down arrow allows us to toggle through whatever we might want to change. Let's say I wanted to change my respiratory rate. I would highlight the word breath rate, hit modify, and change the number. Again, that's how we would get to any setting or alarm. Or if I go back out of here, also remember I mentioned options where we wanted to maybe lock it, change the volume, date and time. Those are things that you would find in your options menu.
If the screen is locked, can you still look at the settings that are set, or would you have to unlock it to look like
You
how
can.
it would look?
Yep. What you would do in that case, if the screen were locked, you could go up to menu
So it's still
and scroll down to the word information, and that would tell you every setting, alarm, and option that's set in the device.
If you forget how to
If you
unlock
don't-
it, one thing to remember, because you might want to remember which buttons. Any Respironics device, it's always the highest button on the screen or the lowest button. 5 seconds.
Yep.
Every device will make that locks.
If you don't even want to tell said doctor how to get into that information level, you could even just tell that person to hold in the from the main screen. Tell them to hold in the down arrow for 5 seconds, and it's gonna flash you into that information screen, no matter what screen we were on. And then you can toggle through again every setting alarm, but you can see we don't have a modify option anymore, so nothing can be changed in this screen. It's a good way to take a peek at what are my settings and what are my actuals when you're looking at that menu. Finish and exit takes you back, but again, it would revert back if you didn't press anything for a few minutes as well. This is what we call our detailed view. This is where we see all of the information that we as clinicians want to see. Occasionally, you might see a DME company set this with a limited view where you just see a clock across the front. That's in that options menu as well. Sometimes we also have patients who maybe really care about their loved ones but don't know about all the parameters that we're looking at here. And we don't want them to be alarmed about anything that they shouldn't be alarmed by. We can turn that limited view off. And then all they would see is
sit there and look at every breath.
yeah. That's a nicer way of saying it. So you would just see a clock across the front without all of the clinical data that we're taking. Go over it too much to the point of boredom, but again, your menu allows you to change any settings that you want to change. You can do options, which would allow you to change alarm volume, lock the device, date, time, screensaver, and then if you want, you could also look at any event log. The event log, as long as your date and time is set correctly, is going to tell you anytime any button was pressed or anything was changed. So we can see that the pressure was changed 2 centimeters at 2:33 a.m. or anything like that would be found in the event log right here. And then we also have information, which I showed you, and the alarm log, which again, similarly is just going to show you any alarm that went off. The alarms are color coded, so a red alarm is high priority, yellow alarm is medium priority, and no color is just kind of a warning to say, hey, something's going on. As it relates to alarms, one of the alarms that I like to talk about is our the alarm that we get the most questions about is the apnea alarm. So I always like to address this and explain because I think this is a little different for every manufacturer. Our apnea alarm is looking for spontaneous efforts only. So you might have a child who, when they go to sleep, completely rides the vent, but you have them in pressure control mode with a set rate of 22 breaths a minute. We can see that patient's getting a breath. I should have used 20 so I could say every 3 seconds. But your apnea alarm is going off. Well, that's because they hadn't spontaneously triggered any of those breaths because they're riding the rate. So the apnea alarm becomes most valuable in modes that are completely spontaneous to tell you truly something's going on. Or it might alert you to something neurologically is going on with my patient, but might not be used long term in modes that have a fixed rate. Those are the big alarms I like to talk about. Again, monitoring. The other thing I'll point out is in your top corner, we can see what type of circuit we're in, which we'll talk about in a moment. The number 1 indicates that we're in our primary setting. Again, I mentioned we can set 2 different prescriptions, and then you'll always see your mode in the top corner, and then your date and time. Additionally, looking externally on the device, there's an SD card in here that's tracking all the data in the device. As we talk about transitions of care and sending our patients home, we can also now remotely monitor patients. So your kids that go home on vents, their physician, their DME company can pull their phone out and see how their ventilator patient's doing in Knoxville. It downloads 3 times a day automatically. They can push data through if they needed information 5 minutes ago and it's been 4 hours since the download. So it's allowed us to really shape the way we monitor and manage these patients. Really, really helpful in the pediatric population, especially as it relates to weaning, right? We can see how our patients are doing and kind of use it to guide when we're going to make changes as that patient's condition perhaps improves over time. In back of the device, pretty simple. Filtering air coming into the device should be cleaned every 2 weeks, replaced every 6 months. Again, I pointed out earlier your oxygen inlet adapter. We can bleed in up to 15 liters per minute of oxygen. We would recommend that you bleed oxygen in through the back of the device versus in through the circuit, which we sometimes see people like to do. When you bleed it in the back of the device, it's considered in the flow that's being output, so it doesn't interrupt any of the readings that you might get from the ventilator. We can hook into your remote alarm systems, nurse call systems, external batteries. That's what some of the ports across the bottom are for. We have a battery in back that can be pulled out. I have to check the internal
Yeah,
battery and see if there's a
yeah,
charge.
charge.
So there's a battery inside the device as well as this small one that can be pulled out. These are what we call hot swappable, so the patient can have a couple of these if they would want to and just swap them in and out of the device. We say that the patients get at least 6 hours of portability. That's kind of our worst case scenario. Again, there's a ton of modes available on Trilogy and a lot of different settings that we can set. Most of our patients, I think, report more like 8 to 10 hours of portability, but 6 is kind of our limit or our worst case scenario, we would say. So when we think of how far ventilation's evolved over years, patients used to have to take a battery that's this big with them to power the older ventilators because they only
Yeah.
lasted 45 minutes, right?
Yes, you can have multiple batteries, we have external chargers.
Yeah. So
car
a lot of
batteries.
freedom, but certainly benefits the quality of life of the patient and everyone else in the family. All right, that takes us to the circuit, which we'll talk about next. So we can use what we call an active circuit or a passive circuit on the Trilogy. I'll ask this before we even get to it. I know some of you guys have used Trilogy before. Does anybody know what kind of circuit we like on Trilogy? Yeah. So our recommendation every single time is going to be to start with the passive circuit. By passive circuit, we mean one single limb with a passive form of exhalation, right? There's no valve here that has to open and close. We're just passively exhaling. Not only do we recommend always starting with a passive circuit, we actually recommend starting with what we term the adult passive circuit. There are no age or weight requirements on the circuits. It's simply that the larger diameter tube, we have found the patients have a lower work of breathing on. And so children do a lot better on the larger diameter tube than what you're used to using on your servos.
Even our pediatric circuits.
Even our
Creates so
pediatric
much
circuit.
airway resistance.
Yeah.
We've switched patients that were struggling and do phenomenal.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that the main thought is always, oh, I need to pick a pediatric circuit because this is a pediatric patient. But we're here to tell you that patients will almost always do much, much better on the adult circuit. So much that I actually think we're changing the naming of our circuits in the future, and we're just going to call them X millimeters circuits to not have any confusion. But definitely go this route. A couple of benefits of having the passive circuit. Number one, when we talk about home ventilation, these patients, their caregivers, they didn't go to respiratory school like we did. We can't expect them to be complete experts in everything, right? And one of the things that can be a frustration is if something becomes disconnected, where do I reconnect it? You know, there's 2 tubes on the servo. When we talk about ventilators of the past, LTV had 1 large tube and 3 small ones, and there can be anxiety when something becomes disconnected. On Trilogy with the passive circuit, it's pretty simple. We all know where that just came off of, and we can just pop it right back on very quickly for the patient. So simplicity and safety certainly come into play when we talk about the passive circuit. If we were using an active circuit, we would have additional lines coming off of it that would be powering a balloon valve, and they would be connected to these nipple adapters that you see here. Again, can occasionally be done, but this is going to be the much more simple option. The other reason we really like the passive circuit is it allows us to use what we call our auto track technology. It's much better from a triggering, cycling, and overall synchrony perspective. Digital auto track is a technology that's in many Respironics devices, from our V60s, cough assist, our PAP devices. And I kind of always say, if you see the term track, auto track, or anything of the like in a Respironics device, you should choose it because it's going to be the more synchronous, comfortable option for your patients. In the world of Trilogy, when you're choosing your trigger type for the patient, you can choose between a flow trigger, auto track, or auto track sensitive. Obviously, we would recommend using the auto tracks, as I mentioned. In general, auto track sensitive was developed for the pediatric population, auto track for the adult population, but they are also completely interchangeable. And so it's just using kind of good clinical skills, right? If I put my patient on auto track sensitive and they were on average breathing 40 times a minute on the servo, and suddenly I see that they're breathing 80 times a minute, maybe it was a little too sensitive. I switched to auto
We
track.
had that happen here.
Yeah.
So,
Or if I put them on auto track
bigger,
and suddenly they're not triggering spontaneously any of their breaths, but they were, switch them to auto track sensitive. So just kind of very simple when you're deciding which one of those routes to go. But with the auto track, you're gonna notice much more synchrony over time. Why auto track is so important, especially when we talk about our patients that are going home, is because you guys aren't there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we know a lot of our kids, go ahead.
On auto track, so the patient has to remove 6 cc's to initiate the birth. Auto track sensitive is 3 cc's. So you will have some of the bigger babies.
Yeah, so that's the threshold. Thanks for stopping me on that. You know, a lot of your kids, are your patients mostly cuff trach or cuffless trach when you send them home? Both? Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that we recognize is, especially for the cuffless trach kids, is they obviously have a leak around it, especially as they grow, that leak will grow as well. And so when we use things like flow triggers or pressure triggers that you're maybe more used to on your hospital vents, when those leaks develop, you're here to catch it. When we're home, we're not there to catch it. And so essentially also with auto track, it's gonna move your trigger and cycle threshold as those flow patterns and leaks change to remain more synchronous with your patient. So auto track is one of the constants that we like with Trilogy, and auto track technology is only found on the passive circuit that we talked about.
Something to add to that, because it just happened this week on a patient. Sometimes the DMEs will bring in cheap aftermarket circuits or corrugated tubing or that type of stuff. And you can see when, if you can see it right now, when it gives a breath, that tubing expands. We had one this week with a non-cuff trach that kept setting off the alarm, and all we did was change the tubing from an actual CPAP tubing to a ventilator circuit to stop that alarm. So they was losing so much pressure in the expanding of that tube, as well as through the cuff and the exhalation port that was setting off that alarm. I know we had one a while back that we had to change from that. I think it was a Lincare patient that was having the same issue. They were rebreathing CO2, and we changed the circuit, and it was fine too. The stiffer circuits are going to work better, especially in babies.
Yeah, very good point. So again, auto track is a constant, only available on the passive circuit. The other reason that we really like our passive circuit is it gives us access to this AVAPS technology, which is a mode that we would also recommend. So you're probably learning here, there's some things that we say are kind of great recipes for optimal ventilation for our patients long term. Number one is using the Trilogy in general. That's with the passive circuit. And then anytime you can use this AVAPS technology, we're going to do our best to support patients as they change. Whether they're getting worse or getting better, the vent will be proactive and changing as their condition changes. Do you use a lot of PRVC here? Yeah. And so this is essentially our version of PRVC that's better for long-term chronic ventilation management for the unsedated patient that we deal with in the home. And so the way it works is typically we're going to go into one of two modes, pressure control mode or ST mode. And you'll activate that mode, and then underneath that in your menu, you're going to have the option to turn AVAPS on. Traditionally, whether you're setting pressure control mode or ST mode, you would be programming an IPAP, as we call it, which is synonymous with PIP, or an EPAP, as we call it, which is synonymous with PEEP, and a respiratory rate. When we activate this AVAPS technology, instead of just setting an IPAP, we're now going to set an IPAP range, which targets a tidal volume. So let's say we're going to put baby Heath on the Trilogy, and we're going to give him a volume of 75 cc's is what we think is appropriate for his size, right? And you were on your servo averaging a PIP of 22. Our initial recommendation is going to be, let's go into pressure control mode, activate that, turn AVAPS technology on, and initially we'd like you to set your IPAP minimum to 22, because we already know that that's the pressure that was supporting my patient on the servo. And then we're going to give ourselves a window above that, 10 to 15 centimeters above that the device could automatically change to target the volume that we programmed. Again, I said we're going to target a volume of 75. So I would set an IPAP minimum of 10, an IPAP, or 22, an IPAP maximum of 32, 35, somewhere around there, my targeted volume of 75 cc's. I'm also going to set what's called an AVAPS rate, and this is what's going to control how fast the algorithm works. You can set the AVAPS rate between 1 and 5 centimeters of water pressure, and that's how quickly it changes over a minute period. Our recommendation is going to be an AVAPS rate of 5. So if baby Heath is recognized to only be getting 30 cc tidal volume, how fast do I want to increase his pressure to get him back to what I told it to give him of 75? An AVAPS rate of 5, in this case, would go from 22 to 27 pip in 1 minute. So it would constantly be assessing where am I at with my targeted tidal volume, and do I need to increase or decrease pressure within this range to ensure it. So again, sounds just like PRVC pretty much, right? So we're gonna allow cruise control to take control, set this big range. So whatever your PIP was averaging, bring it over, make that your IPAP min, give yourself a window above it, and target a tidal volume.
So the AVAPS rate tells you, or tells the vet how many breaths it's gonna take to calculate.
Nope, the
How many-
AVAPS rate tells you how much pressure it would change in a 1 minute period if the patient were not getting their targeted tidal volume.
If they're on 5, it's gonna change 5 centimeters in there of pressure. So if you had a patient breathing 15 breaths a minute, it's about 0.3 per breath. If they're breathing faster, then it's gonna be faster.
Does anyone know how fast PRVC changes?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so PRVC is a little bit faster. And why that is okay in the hospital is because when you're using PRVC, your patients are sedated. When we're talking about long-term vent management, we take those patients off of sedation when they go home. And we need something that's going to be very responsive to their changing condition, but also not wake them up when they're sleeping. And so this algorithm, this AVAPS rate, would control how fast it changes. And what we found is it's very fast to be reactive, or proactive, I should say, to the patient's changing condition, but not so aggressive that it's going to cause arousals for the patient in the night. All right, so now our recommendation again is we're going to go to pressure control mode, turn AVAPS on, target a tidal volume, set a range of pressures, and an AVAPS rate of 5. And that AVAPS rate of 5 is kind of that next constant. And so this volume targeting technology is really important when we talk about long-term ventilation management. Why? Well, if this is a patient who has a progressive neuromuscular disorder, maybe today they did only need a pressure of 22 to ventilate. But over time, they get weaker and weaker, and they need higher pressures. If we sent that patient home on only pressure-driven ventilation, let's say we sent them home on PCSIMV, what's gonna happen? Over time, they're not moving enough volume. CO2 starts to climb. Even if you think about patients, maybe here you're suctioning a child every 2 to 3 hours, and they go home and mom's only suctioning them every 8 hours. If they're on pressure-only ventilation, well, the volume, likely, that they're moving immediately after suctioning versus 7 hours ago since they were suctioned and they have a lot of secretions in the lungs, is going to vary significantly. And so this technology, this AVAPS technology, allows us to marry the best of pressure and volume ventilation for our patients, again, when we remove you all as the clinicians 24/7. So that mode would be our mode of choice in managing our patients. So again, constants, Trilogy, passive circuit, auto track for your trigger type, AVAPS for your technology that you want to use in the pressure control mode in most cases. The last constant that I like to talk about is rise. This is something that we sometimes get a call about too. The rise on Trilogy is in your settings, and it can be set between 1 and 6. A rise of 1 is the fastest, and 6 is the slowest. So occasionally when we have a hospital that's maybe new to Trilogy, or a physician that's new to Trilogy, I'll get a phone call and they'll say, hey, we had our patient on the servo and they were averaging a PIP of 28. This was their volume. We put them on Trilogy and they're not getting hardly any volume. What's going on? And what we found is there were these NICU kids that have these teeny tiny eye times that they set the rise to 6. And so the patient was never even hitting peak pressure before the breath cycled. So our recommendation is going to be to start with a rise of 1. That's the fastest, and we're going to ensure that we kind of rise and then have that expansion for the period of the eye time. Any questions about AVAPS, the circuit, or some of the constants that we talked about that are recipes for success with Trilogy? Yeah, go for it.
Set a tidal volume target and a pressure range. What if their compliance improves? Do they have the ability to get more than what you've set?
Yeah, so the same way, so if the device would recognize my patient were not getting their targeted tidal volume and it would increase pressure, if it recognizes that they're overshooting their tidal volume, it'll decrease pressure, but only within the range that you have set. And so that's why we say initially, just to make sure that there's no shock to the patient's system when we transition them over, we like to take what you are averaging as a PIP and bring that over. Once you realize my patient's doing great, they're loving Trilogy, then we can talk about opening that window on the underside as well to help the patient. And over time, absolutely, we have some hospitals that use this technology as their weaning tool, right? What they find is over time, they continue to bring that minimum down. And one of my hospitals, once they see that their patient is averaging only, a delta of about 4 or 5 centimeters, they say, okay, well, we're ready to start some trick collar trials now. And so, yes, absolutely widen it down as well over time.
A good way to actually see that. This right now, we got the tidal volume set at about 300. So it's taking peak inspirated pressure to 23.9. If I use my vent here, there's a little bit of resistance. What am I at now?
So yeah, you can see we dropped to 180.
So you'll watch that peak
What it's gonna
inspiratory
start to see
pressure
is-
start go up.
Yep, it recognized that it wasn't hitting its targeted tidal volume anymore, so immediately it starts to increase the peak pressure within the range to get us back to the volume that we're telling it to be at.
So you keep up with it.
It'll continue. So the minute only controls how fast the pressure changes in a 1 minute period. It can, if it takes 30 seconds to get back to the targeted tidal volume, then it only took 30 seconds. If it takes 3 minutes to get back, then it takes 3 minutes. That's just kind of putting a regulation on. I'm never going to go over 5 centimeters in 1 minute. Is what that's saying.
And then you take it back off to answer your question earlier. The next breath's gonna be big, and then you'll see it start backing back down a little bit.
So you can see it went up to 440. Yep.
So
Now
so
within
it's
a breath
gonna
or two, you're
fluctuate
going to
on.
start to see it
And
go
you
back down.
shouldn't have a big swing breath to breath. It should be, unless it's plugged or something like that, it should be more mild. Especially
Yeah.
since this is a chronic, not acute, need PRBC.
Yeah, so yeah, this was exaggerated change.
Yes.
You can see we're back down to 400. Yeah, so same exact thing. Yeah. So yeah, when you're looking at the vent, if you see, well, I have it set to give 100 and it says it's giving 150, what's wrong? Hey, my compliance is better than I thought it was. I can bring my pressure range down a little bit. All right, did I forget anything?
Unless they got questions.
Yeah, anybody, any questions? That's really the basis of the Trilogy. You can come up and play with it if you've not had a chance to.
The only other
mess
thing we
around with it
didn't
before.
mention, I think we touched on it, be real cognizant of how much dead space you put here. This, this machine doesn't calculate the dead space like those machines do. So a home machine just doesn't. So if you got Entitle and Omniflex and suction and a bunch of different things, you may put them on the same pressure you had on there, but their CO2 goes up when you stick them on here because we got all that. So we need to see how much the dead space is and either increase the pressure or take some of the dead space out. Kristen and I beat our head against the wall till we figured that out.
Expiratory valve without the little pneumatic thing on it.
It ain't really an
Yeah.
This is the one that you all use, actually. This one here, because it has 2 different fittings on each end instead of the old one that we used to have. So this will be the one that you use. This really is
Well, we
a
just had a
connect.
little fella chew it off last night.
Oh,
Chewed what? The rubber
The
part off?
little cap.
oh my goodness.
Interesting.
That's a new one.
That's a new one.
It happened
Funny.
last night, so I was like, oh, well.
We do have other ones, but what happens when you use it? You had one a minute. Oh,
Yeah,
she's
so
got one.
I'm glad
You
that you
just-
brought this up so we can talk a bit about it. So with the passive circuit, the intent is that we have to have some sort of passive exhalation happening. So the leak is intentional in this case, and it's allowing us to clear CO2. This is our preferred one, the one that you mentioned your little guy chewed the rubber cap off of right here. The reason we like this one, to Heath's point, is we can really minimize dead space with this particular adapter because we can go directly from the adapter to the test line. The other benefit of this one is, he alluded to this in the beginning, we're bleeding oxygen in through the back of the device and we're giving variable pressures as patient's condition changes. Well, there's a direct correlation between as pressure goes up, the intentional leak coming out of this valve goes up. And so the nice thing about this one is it has a slightly lower leak than the other one that I'm about to show you. And so it's great for patients who maybe are on slightly higher FiO2s. It's going to conserve a little bit more because although the intent is to clear CO2, we can't pick which molecules we're losing out of that valve. So we are unfortunately losing a little bit of oxygen as well. So this is a great way to optimize FiO2 for your patients as well. Cons of this one is we're leaking out this area right here, which is, I don't know, the size of a dime, a little larger, a penny maybe. If the patient has copious amounts of secretions, they could cover that. Now, if that were to happen, you would absolutely get an alarm. It would say low circuit leak. We would know we weren't having a sufficient leak to clear CO2, and we would need to just swap this out, clean it, etc. Right? The nice thing, if your little guy did chew off the rubber piece and expose an additional orifice in the device, something that we didn't mention is that the Trilogy is really well known for its leak compensation capabilities. And so it recognizes those leaks on a breath-to-breath basis and compensates for them. So that what you programmed in the device is what the patient's actually getting. So that being said, we obviously don't want the device to have to compensate all the time, and we don't want him to choke on chewing that. So the other option we would have is what we call a whisper swivel. Benefits of this one, it leaks the whole way around 360 degrees. So better for kids who have a lot of secretions. Good for kids who are chewing off the rubber adapter on there. Not bad, but less optimal for patients who are on really high FiO2s because it also has a slightly larger intentional leak. So our goal would be to start with this one, but if you have reasons then you need to switch, this is a good
Switch your
option as
CO2,
well.
make sure you don't have to up the pressure or constant, because you're going to have to put another adapter onto that one. That's why I have dead space. Yes.
Yeah, so
Because
this one
of,
we have to
because
add
of the
something.
orifice that y'all are using on your entitle and your other things.
Great question. Anyone else any questions about Trilogy?
You were saying something about requiring less than 40% before going home, and that there was a reason why you couldn't bleed as much through the back.
Oh, right. It's because of the leak.
Leak,
So as
okay.
pressure goes up, intentional leak goes up. As leak goes up, we're losing oxygen. Most DME companies in general, quite honestly, have a limit of taking patients over 40% FiO2 anyways. But this valve will truly help to optimize FiO2 conservation for your patients.
Okay.
Yep. Questions? Anybody else? No? Well, thanks for having us, y'all.
Thanks.